Good. Okay, so I'll try to fix my speaker, but it's fine that you can hear me for now. I'll try to fix it later, but if you need to say something, put it in the chat so I'll stop talking and then you can say it. But in the meantime, I'll try to fix my speaker. I'm not sure why it's not working. Okay, so this is the third workshop. We're going to talk about scientific writing and a publication strategy. Now, when making this workshop, there's so much involved in writing papers and publishing papers that I think uh, uh, my aim is not to give you an entire detailed summary of how to do each completely. But definitely the goal of this was to talk about things that most other workshops on writing or publishing don't talk about. And of course, I'm happy to provide more basic, instruction about things that other workshops do talk about. Um, but the idea is, I guess one of the goals is to give you the information you need to set yourself apart from others who might be in the same process, who might be engaging in scientific writing and publishing, who might be publishing, trying to improve their CV for residency applications, fellowship applications, professorships. But to really give you some tips that I would say even most professors that I've even worked with for that have been professors for decade longs probably don't even know. A lot of common mistakes or common assumptions made that reflect in your writing that set you apart from really, really good writing and okay writing. I think that's the purpose here. But the caveat here is that a writing workshop within 1.5 hours is not possible. Writing courses exist. A lot of them are free and online and available. And they could take hours and hours for you to really understand how to write papers or even write in general. Same thing with publishing, really. I think having a publication strategy, I'll talk about it and I'll share with you how I approach it, and then Mobina Shazim will share with how they approach it, some things to keep in mind. But of course, the publication strategy will depend upon your topic, will depend upon your discipline. There's always disciplinary differences on how you might approach developing a publication strategy, how you might approach deciding on where to publish, how to frame the publications, depending upon just sort of disciplinary conventions that we talk about. But I'll mention a few things and hopefully that would be helpful to you. So so the third workshop, second last workshop of the series. The next workshop is next Wednesday, and then we'll wrap up the series. At the next workshop, just a heads up, we will have Mubin and Shazim lead that workshop, and they're going to talk about, enhancing your academic CV for residency and beyond for the context of Pakistan, and then also for the context of United States. And as well, within that, we'll also provide lots of other feedback, or at least I'll try to provide feedback beyond United States and Pakistan because I'm not in those contexts, but just enhancing your academic CV in general, having a holistic approach to being known in the field for a particular topic or a particular niche. I think that will also be somewhat part of it informally. So that is next week. Then after that, I guess a quick note after that, we're still trying to figure out what to do next. Of course, your experience through these workshops is valuable. If you could let us know what you would be interested in seeing, what kind of workshops you're interested in seeing, if the format even works, you want different kinds of topics, different way of presenting the material, more interactive material. Do you want something more applied, like something like a statistics workshop, where you do a statistics, the sort of solve a statistics problem, or other analysis problems, things like that. We would appreciate any feedback you send at the end of this workshop over email as well. It's completely fine. But we are figuring that out. But coming to this workshop, we have 3 outcomes, learning outcomes. One is to explore some writing basics and how to write stronger. And again, reiterating what I said in the first slide is there's lots of writing basics, and I assume especially based on the positions that you have, that all of you know generally, even if you haven't taken a writing course, all of you have written something, therefore you probably know most of the writing basics. The focus here, because it's not meant to guide like, you know, very, very young students. It's meant to guide people in the field, have been writing. Focus is to provide you with some additional details that you may not know that will take your writing to another level, take your writing maybe not to, maybe not make it dramatically better, but it'll definitely be things that experts in the fields notice, and definitely be ways for definitely be ways you can convey your ideas in a more powerful, more compelling way, and therefore get your arguments across, and therefore maybe even be more easily published, right? These are all kinds of things that come into mind when it comes to writing. Second is to describe the research paper structure. Now we did this for a funding proposal, but now we're gonna sort of have an analogous parallel approach to talk about the research paper itself, with the caveat that this is just a general structure. You know, there are going to be slight differences depending on the discipline, journal, and things like that. But this is a good sort of overall general structure to follow to see if if you have all the big content pieces within a particular paper. At the same time, we'll also talk about the peer review process, because we haven't talked about that yet, but the peer review process is in of itself very, very very complicated. It is both an art and a science to navigate the peer review process. And a lot of people don't know what it takes and what the stages are. There's not even a lot of training to really tell you what the peer review process is. Well, one is because, you know, it differs between journals and disciplines, but generally you can identify some specific aspects of peer review regardless of which discipline or journal you're in. And we'll talk a little bit about that as well. We'll do a writing exercise at the very end, just to bring in some of the points from at least the first learning outcome. And we'll also have some time at the end for Mubin and Shazim, who have written quite a bit about different topics, especially clinical topics. So I've written some stuff on clinical, but of course, Mubin and Shazim are more experts in clinical medicine topics, on ENT and gastroenterology. So they'll talk about their experiences in those at the very end, and hopefully they can shed some more light and maybe answer some questions you might have. Okay, so let's get into the first outcome, which is about writing basics. So you can, of course, take a writing course to learn more about writing basics, if you need to. I did do a writing course, but very, very briefly, and that's why I say that maybe sometimes for some people it may not be beneficial. Because if you've been writing and you've been in the professional field, you probably know all the basics. You may learn to like label different concepts and ideas in different grammatical forms, right? Which may or may not be useful to you, but if you've been writing, you know how to generally use them. So I'm not going to get into those basics that every course talks about, things like definite, indefinite articles and all that kind of stuff. I'm not going to get into that. I'm going to give you some of the tricks of the trade that I've called it that may set you apart from others, because these are things that I see are either not understood, or even if they are understood, they're not implemented consistently. And if you understand and implement them consistently, I can guarantee you that your writing will be more compelling. And if your writing is more compelling and more powerful, it is more likely to be published, and more likely to actually be read by someone, an expert, and more likely to have an impact, be contacted by the expert for more work. Like there's a lot of these downstream outcomes that can come from writing better, writing clearly, writing more powerfully, writing more compellingly. But in particular, there are three tricks of the trade that I want to talk about for this workshop, right? And these take some researchers and professors years to learn, but if you get it now, you'll be ahead of them. The first is, actually it's not working, voice. Voice is important, particularly for people in medicine, which all of you are in some way or form, because you use one voice when you talk about when you repeat your findings, repeat your results. But there are two voices, and each voice has a different purpose and a different way of presenting the findings. The difference between the voice, which is passive and active voice, is whether the object or the actor appear first in a sentence. So what do I mean by that? So passive voice is the one that you're most familiar with, right? Passive voice is the most common voice used in research studies. But passive voice is not natural, right? Think about this. The meeting was hosted by the consortium. That's passive voice because the actor appears after consortium, appears after the object or the event, in this case, the meeting. The passive voice is not natural. It's technically more confusing to the reader compared to the other active voice that I'll talk about because it uses more words and it puts the actor after the object. Active voice is less confusing and more natural because think of it this way. The consortium hosted the meeting, uses less words, it's clearer, the link is more natural. Yeah, the meeting is hosted by the consortium, right? Like the consortium hosted the meeting. And generally speaking, active voice is much better at communicating to your points. So, I mean, let me step back here for a second because this took me a long time to understand. Why does a change in 3 words and the orientation have such a big impact? It does. When someone, this is going into the cognitive science degree, when someone reads a paper, whether it be an expert who's familiar with the language or be a new researcher, new physician who is somewhat getting familiar with the language, papers tend to be very heavy in jargon. They tend to have complex sentences. They tend to have a lot of content. When you encounter a paper with lots of passive voices, cognitively, and this is documented, it will take them much longer to comprehend. And then it will take them much longer to read it, to comprehend it, to understand it. Active voice, on the other hand, comparatively, will make it a lot easier to understand it, just cognitively, because it is more natural to how humans make connections between actors and objects when they read. That's the big point here. And we'll show another example at the very end with the writing exercise, but this is the difference between passive and active voice. The thing I'll mention here is that clinical medicine, biomedicine, physics research, biotechnology research, likely most of the research you do has generally used passive voice. Which is, of course, I've said all these things, the benefit of active voice. Why are we all using passive voice? There's many reasons for this, and I don't know what the exact reason is why we continue to use passive voice. But passive voice is the convention, but there are ways to get around it and improve your writing, even if you use passive voice. And the ways include follows. If you do use passive voice, use it for less complex sentences, right? Don't like, this is a very simple sentence. The meeting was hosted by consortium, but you can imagine that this may not be the case for an article. It may be like the meeting was hosted by the consortium and something else because of this, by this, through that. That tends to be an article. So try not to do that because then it gets much more complicated than it should be than if it was active voice. The other thing is to be consistent in either using passive or active voice. Now, this is another issue that I've seen consistently. So a lot of times when papers are written, and I've read papers that are written in very reputable journals, they switch between passive and active voices. And for some reasons, it might make sense to actually switch between passive and active voice if it's deliberate. Passive voice compared to active voice puts emphasis on the meeting, right? In this example, the emphasis is on the meeting. You want to emphasize the meeting over the actor, the consortium in this, which sometimes it can make sense, right? And it's completely fine. And in very creative novel writing, there is constant switching because the emphasis on the object of the actor matters a lot based on what message you want to convey. But of course, we're not writing novels here, so we have to be a bit more simpler in our approach. Switching between passive and active voice can further. You still hear me? So I'll put in the chat if you can still hear me, because that's okay. Good. Yeah, I just had a message
Yes,
saying.
we can hear you.
Okay, I can hear you now too, so I guess it fixed itself. Yeah, what was I saying? Switching between passive and active voices within an article can be very confusing because people use, it's just, you may not be cognitively thinking, but if, like, think about it this way, that, one sentence structure starts with an object first and another sentence with, and then the one right after that starts with the actor first. You have to constantly switch the way you associate actors and objects. And if you do that inconsistently, having passive and active, the passive, and active, then that will become even harder than if it was just all passive or all active. Right? So that's another thing. Like after this workshop, go take an article in a journal, and I will probably tell you that they probably use passive and active voice both and inconsistently. And this just makes it harder for someone to understand, and it makes it harder to make a compelling article, which of course may seem minor, but these are things that will set you apart if you can do it consistently. Yeah. So that's passive and active voice, and we'll have an example at the very end. Let's talk about the second trick of the trade, which are conventions. And what I mean by this are disciplinary conventions, right? Each discipline has slightly different writing conventions. And again, we'll talk about this at the very end with the writing exercise. But, for example, just think about it. Public health versus surgery, biotechnology versus biomedicine. Take two articles, one from each of those disciplines, and compare them. They're going to be talking about very different things, of course, but the way they talk about those things is also going to be very different. Public health might use a lot of theories, surgery might use a lot of numbers, right? These are disciplinary conventions that do make that do need to be acknowledged and considered when writing a paper. And how do you learn these disciplinary conventions? Now, there's no of course, I can tell you about some of the conventions that I'm familiar with public health, with quality improvement, with management, because these are fields that I'm focused on. But they come with learning, they come with reading, they come with rereading, and they come with peer reviewing, right? Just doing this constantly, a little bit each day, maybe reading an article each day or every other day, you just eventually you learn those implicit assumptions and those not assumptions, those conventions that exist on how to talk about it. But this is also very similar to the third one, which are assumptions. Now, part of what is different between the disciplines is the assumptions that make. And this gets into a whole different course, a whole course that we have on research philosophy, which is not really needed unless you really want to get into research philosophy and assumptions that research makes. Which can be very beneficial to build more effective, meaningful, genuine, and impactful research. So I'm not going to give you a crash course in research philosophy, but I'll talk about why assumptions and knowing assumptions and attending to assumptions in disciplines and writing is important. Somewhat. Now, the assumptions that are made behind a research question, the assumptions that are made behind the whole overall philosophy or approach of a research study influences what findings they generate. So you think of this as assumptions. So each discipline and area has their own assumptions. And the best example I can give you is that, public health will talk about concepts and ideas in relation to their impact on the public, right? Public health, right? Look at of government intervention and look at how many community members improve, right? That's sort of the best example of an assumption. While biotechnology or biomedical studies will be hyper-focused, probably on experimental situations and clinical and statistical significance. And just having those kinds of assumptions of what is considered quote unquote findings, impact on public health versus clinical and statistical significance. This will influence what they say in the paper. Again, this is high level, but this will make a little bit more sense when we get into the exercise because it'll be a bit more practical. So now you might be thinking, you know, these are the three tricks of the trade that you explained to me. How do I understand the three tricks of the trade and actually implement them in my writing to strengthen it? What's the process of learning about conventions and what is the process of learning about assumptions and being mindful of them and actually leveraging them to improve my writing? The answer is simple, but I think the most difficult part of the answer and the process is persistence, right? I've been doing this for more than 10 years now, and I've been persistent. Therefore, I'm able to come here and tell you about all these things. But if you haven't already, today onwards, I want you to make a couple of commitments to yourself. The commitment is, a lifelong journey of reading, writing, and learning. That's just, the field that we're in: medicine, public health, management, research. If you're not reading, you're not really in the field. So reading, writing, and learning is essential if you want to get to that next level or to the highest level. So committing yourself to being curious and learning from articles, presentations, and videos that others create. And that will in turn, maybe not explicitly, but definitely implicitly help you create your own. And this will be the foundation with which you build your ability to write and communicate better. So what is this process? First is to read and reread, right? And this is something that people may, and oftentimes I also miss too. So I mean, I'll be honest here. It's not just about reading an article, but sometimes about rereading an article, right? It can be very hard to get yourself motivated to reread an article that you've already read. Trust me, I know this. Like, I don't reread many articles, but sometimes I do. And sometimes I have to really force myself to reread articles. But the reason why you reread articles is because when you read an article for the first time, the way your brain works is very different than when you reread an article. When you read an article, you're trying to understand the crux of the paper. What did they try to do? How did they do it? What were the main points, right? And you can get that from the abstract, from the end of the introduction, from some method sections, from the beginning of the findings or the beginning of the discussion, like some of the main points, main take-home points. And for complex articles, if you're reading for the first time, you're just going to be focused on that, just trying to understand the foundation, the main arguments. Rereading an article will help you to understand complex articles better, because now that you've understood the main point, now you're going to start to read between the lines. And there's always hidden messages and implications between the lines. So this is a hidden tip, right? Like if you someone okay. So this is a hidden tip that if your goal is to get into a literature and your goal is to develop a research program or a research project or systematic review, you want to find like what are like potential areas I can focus on. Then read an article to understand basic concepts, and then read it again with that understanding to try to figure out what are they really implying, what haven't they investigated, what haven't they assumed, right? What haven't they talked about? And those may come slightly from the first reading, but will definitely come from the second reading, because your mind has the basic concepts, and your mind, if you focus it, can't attend to answering those questions. That's where rereading is important. And the second is writing and rewriting, right? So this is the explanation to this is very similar to reading and rewriting, reading and rereading. But consider this, right? When you write when you have a set of findings, let's say, right, you've done the analysis, you have a set of bullet points, and then you convert those bullet points into, you synthesize them and you convert them into a paragraph format that will go into your findings section in a manuscript. That process we've discussed in previous workshop, that synthesis process, right? You put it into an outline, which is a list of bullet points, you reorganize the bullet points, and then you put it into a paragraph format. And of course, that process can be complicated, but it comes with practice, which I'm sure all of you have done at some point. But rewriting is interesting because often, if you ever engage in an exercise, and maybe you want to see it for yourself, once you've written a set of findings for the first time, the next day, rewriting it again using the same process, you'll start to see connections between the different bullet points and findings that you didn't see before. And you might ask, why is that the case? And honestly, I'm sure there's some research on this, but I haven't come across this. But what I honestly think is that every day, every new day, or every 6 hours, or once you've rested, whatever rest means to you, could be a full night's rest, or it could mean like a break in the afternoon. Every time you do that, or every time you engage with someone else that's outside of the particular topic, or you talk to someone, you have a meeting, and you look back at the same thing, your mind approaches that thing in a slightly different way. So if I write a paragraph this morning and then I write the paragraph again after this meeting, I will write it slightly differently. Why is that the case? Well, because this conversation is probably bringing in different types of connections and ideas and concepts that weren't there in the morning, but then I will implicitly use when I rewrite it. Sometimes this process can be really helpful. And it can be really helpful for two reasons. One is it can be helpful to understand the findings more deeply, of course. It can, when you write and rewrite, you will, of course, uncover different ways of talking about the same thing. And when you uncover different ways of talking about the same thing, or then you can uncover what is really the most optimized, most compelling way to put it in your paper. And two is when you rewrite, you'll be more on the critiquing end of your findings. You'll be more able to understand those assumptions and maybe even those conventions that are in the discipline, and better leverage them to create a compelling piece. Doing something again just makes it better because it makes you more familiar with the content. And then finally, there is the review and feedback. Now, review and feedback, we'll talk about the peer review process as well, which is slightly different, but it's part of the review and feedback. It's important to, alongside reading and rereading, writing and rewriting, to be reviewing others' work, providing them feedback, and having other people review your work and reviewing their feedback. So it's not just about you make a paper and you ask someone else's feedback. It's also about you providing feedback to others on others' papers. Both of those processes cognitively are different and can help you better understand how you can write better and compelling papers. Reviewing and feedback, just stepping back, is important because if your goal is to publish a paper, you will get feedback, most likely, in the peer review process. How do you handle that feedback? Lots of skills you can learn. The most important skill is to identify what the peer reviewer is actually saying. Oftentimes it's confusing. I've been on the receiving end so many times that it's really confusing. I don't know. Identifying the core request and suggestion is an essential skill when it comes to reading and responding to feedback. But how do you really learn that is not just by being on the receiving end, but also being on the sending end. When you read something and provide feedback to another person, you will start to understand how feedback is constructed. And when you're actually on the receiving end of that, you'll have a better idea of how someone may be constructing feedback. So very important to review and provide feedback on others, as well as receive feedback from others on work. And this process is very iterative. It is a journey, like I mentioned, making the commitment of reading, writing, and learning, and being curious from others' pieces, on others' articles, presentations, and videos. And this will take time, and in some ways, I'm not an expert. I would say I'm still learning about how to read and write. Every day I learn something new about a new discipline. But if you make this commitment of reading, writing, learning, you'll see a difference 1 month down the line, 1 year down the line, 5 years down the line, 10 years down the line. Recently, I read my first paper, which was 11 years ago. But yeah, it's a huge difference. I would not write that paper in the same way if I were to write it today, right? That in of itself is evidence that making a commitment to reading, writing, learning every day, every other day, every third day, some commitment that works for you, but making it consistent will help you in the long term, and you will see dramatic improvements in how you write and how you convey ideas. And that's the goal. Convey your ideas better, write better, and that will lead to not just stronger writing, but also multiple opportunities. You'll receive multiple invitations. I can say that, of course, the first time I started this pathway, I wrote a bunch of articles, methodological articles, and they received a lot of attention. But now, because I'm like much later in my career, still relatively early-ish, I'm receiving a lot more conference invitations, keynote invitations, presentations, abstracts, the publication invitations, waived fees, like consulting invitations, and it's endless. Like I receive multiple emails every single day. And these are just evidence of saying that if you commit to that process and you stay patient and persistent towards it, it will give you fruits in the end. And it will give you fruits that over time increase and have a snowball effect. Okay, moving swiftly forward, let's talk about the research paper structure. So this is related to the funding proposal work, funding. I think we talked about, but I may be confusing with another workshop I delivered. But anyways, let's talk about the research paper structure. So the first is really the background, and this could be called the background, the literature review. It could be called the introduction. That depends on the journal you publish, because sometimes journals talk about it in different ways, but really the purpose is the same. Is to provide an overall picture and a literature review of the literature you're really talking about, in which your research study is situated in. This starts with the big picture, answering the question, what is the problem? What is the prevalence? But in a way that's very much linked to your research objectives. A good introduction, from what I've seen, usually starts with some compelling numbers. And the reason why a good introduction starts with the compelling numbers or statistics is it's a great way to bring in people into the article. It's a great way to hook them in, right? Like a crazy statistic that half the people die from a particular, like imagine reading that as the first sentence, right? As opposed to something that's very, very niche and specific, right? Even if your research study is very, very specific, which research studies tend to be, bringing in someone with the higher with a higher level, statistic that makes sense, that's attractive, that hooks in people, but of course it's still true, you don't want to lie, can really give them the motivation to keep reading, and that's what you want. Then what the background does, it starts to further drill down to the specific issue, and ending the background with the rationale for the study, research objectives, and questions. So backgrounds can differ between different disciplines, right? But think about it in sort of three paragraphs. One is the big issue, the hook, the compelling number, a few more details, some basic concepts, define any concepts that you use. Second is more specific details. Think of like bridging the big picture, the big problem into your specific research objectives, right? What's the link? How do you carry and hold the hand of the reader to come from the big issue to your specific study? That's the second paragraph. And the third paragraph is describing the rationale for your study, as well as the specific objectives and the questions. And then you get into the methods. That's a natural way to progress from bringing in someone into the article, motivating them to read it, giving them a sort of, we call this a scaffold, right? Giving them a scaffold to come down further to the specific, very, very specific topic and research question of your study. Giving them the first specific topic and research question sometimes can work, especially for experts because they know it, right? But not everyone's going to be an expert. And even experts, if you give them the big picture, they'll better be able to appreciate and understand the research question. This is just how, people's minds generally work. And this is a general, like not all introductions need to have just 3 paragraphs, just keep that in mind. Some have 10 paragraphs, some have 5 paragraphs. Again, this depends on the discipline. I'm writing a narrative inquiry paper for a social science and medicine journal, which is very theoretical. The introduction has 15 paragraphs. Like you can see, it's very, very different. It really depends. I would assume that most of the papers that you write, they're probably on the shorter end. Clinical medicine, biomedicine, clinical papers, they tend to have just maybe 3 paragraphs max, and even those 3 paragraphs are very, very short. But having those 3 structures in mind can help to see how you want to present the main points that bring readers into the topic and explain to them very clearly the research questions. Then it's the method, and we talked about this in depth when we discussed the research proposal and writing. But just to recap, it includes study design, it includes sampling and recruitment, it includes data collection and data analysis methods. And then there's the results or findings section. And I say or findings because this is also a disciplinary convention. A lot of clinical journals say results, a lot of non-clinical journals say findings. So these are just maybe a small example of why conventions matter. This section is, I guess, the meat of your paper, and it contains both findings in a written form as well as charts, figures, and tables. Remember though, and this is something that is often confused, figures and tables, if you choose to include them, cannot repeat the written findings. Should not repeat the written. I mean, of course you can do it, but good writing shouldn't repeat the written findings because that's redundant. Redundant articles are not compelling. Redundant articles waste time. I have read many articles where I read the written findings and I look at the table and I'm like, why am I wasting my time doing this? It's the same exact thing. What you need to do if you include charts and tables is to have the findings go well together, to flow well from each other, but to not to be the same in different formats, same findings in different formats. What does this really mean, practically speaking? The written findings can be a summary of the comprehensive findings found in tables and charts. That's possible. That's one way. On the other hand, the tables and charts can also serve the purpose of elaborating and further nuancing the written findings that you have. In both of these examples, they're not repeating the findings. Maybe slightly short. There's not a hard and fast rule. It's not black and white, slightly short. But the main crux of this and the relationship between charts, tables, figures, and the written version of finding is they don't have to say the same thing. They can't be saying the same thing. They have to be connected to each other, and they have to flow from each other in a way that makes the reader feels that they want to read charts and tables as well, to get to answer some questions that they had in the written findings or vice versa. That's an example of doing writing better. But most people don't do that. Most people repeat, just put findings in a different format. The discussion, this is where you'll summarize the study. That's usually the first section, maybe in a paragraph. What did you set out to do? What did you find? But it also explores the meaning of what you found in comparison to the literature. And this can take in very, very different ways, right? I think generally you're probably most familiar with clinical studies where essentially they say this was found, this outcome was significant, for example, and it led to improvements in outcomes. This intervention was statistically significant, improving outcomes. This is very similar to this X study from this country, etc. That's a very surface level comparison to outside literature that is not included in your work, right? But of course, it can go much deeper, and that really depends upon your discipline. Generally, for clinical studies, that surface level of interpretation is sufficient. So you would compare, you would say whether there's another study that's similar but has similar and has the same findings. But if there's another study that's similar in its methods but has different findings, you would try to conjecture why they're different, right? And you'd be like, well, the sample size is different, the time period different, it happened during COVID, right? That's another level of interpretation and comparison that you can add to enhance your discussion. But it can go even deeper, right? I mean, I won't get into all of that, but there's a whole can go super, super complex and deep and theoretical in the discussion, depending on the discipline you're in. And we'll just keep it at that. But the other thing to include in the discussion are implications and limitations. So implications, what do I mean by that? Implications mean that given the findings, given what we set out to do, given what we did, given the findings, given the comparison to the literature, what does this mean to another person, right? What does it mean to a healthcare professional? What does it mean to a policymaker? What does it mean for other researchers? Those are the implications, really practical policy practice implications. And then finally, you always need to have a limitations of this study. And this is, I mean, you could talk a lot about limitations and how they're framed. Don't discount these limitations. There's usually a way for you to showcase that to peer reviewers and other researchers that you're reflective about your study. And it's not necessary. Okay, let me step back, because I'm thinking from the perspective of my work, which you approach the limitation in a slightly different way. But for clinical work, if there are limitations in your study that are somewhat important caveats that may have influence your findings in significant ways, it's better to mention it than not mention it. It's better to mention it than avoid it. Because most likely than not, if you are seeing that limitation, then probably someone else might as well. And it always seems odd and weird for someone who's reading it and be like, this is a limitation, why didn't they mention it? That's always more odd than actually reading that limitation, being like, okay, at least they mentioned it, they're honest about it, and they know how they probably know how it impacted their work. I have read so many studies where I'm like, this entire method section is messed up, and they don't even talk about it, right? As opposed to other studies where the method section is messed up, but they talk about the method section is like, could see a lot of improvements, but they talk about some of those limitations in a limitation section. I can appreciate them, that they tried to do their best and they weren't able to for various reasons. Conclusion. So this exists sometimes, but it really depends. Think of it as a shorter version of the abstract, which we will talk about next. And I included this at the very end because the best abstracts are developed when the first draft of all the other sections are developed, right? So that's how I sort of naturally order it. Start with the background to understand the methods, results, findings, discussion after all of those, conclusion after the discussion if it exists, and abstract after everything else, because it'll help you to narrow down what's really the best way to convey the main points of your work. And the title is the same thing. Title is like, you want a compelling title that's also accurate, precise. Yeah. It is better to be honest about limitations rather than trying to avoid mention. Yeah, exactly. It is much better. Trust me, because you don't want to be caught on the receiving end of of someone making an article in response to your article and saying, oh, these authors published this paper, but they're completely wrong and they completely missed a massive limitation. That has happened. So if you maybe you haven't encountered this, but I have seen debates happen with articles, just like not actual debates, but just articles. Someone publishes a paper, then there's a response, then response to a response, then there's another response to a response, all within the same journal, and it all starts with a limitation, really. Or sometimes it starts with a finding, but really the root is a limitation. It's always the limitation. So always be honest about those limitations and be reflective and try to explain in a way that makes sense of why this limitation exists. And of course, there's references at the very end. Checking the time. Some time for Mubin to talk. So I guess give me 5-ish more minutes, and then Mubin can share some of his perspectives. So coming into the publication part, selecting the right journal is also, you need a little bit of a strategy for this, but it's not too complicated. At the start of each project, I usually develop what's called a publication plan that includes a journal publication plan. So I usually have some idea of the number, the kinds, and the types of publication that may result from a single study. I remember I talked about this in one of the previous workshops that generally, if you're doing randomized controlled trials, especially big ones, can lead to so many publications, right? And that's something that you need to consider. And a lot of people, don't really understand this. There can be multiple publications from a single study. I've done a randomized controlled trial that has led to 10 publications from one thing, but it was a massive trial with lots of groups and lots of people, lots of subgroup analyses, right? But you might ask, how do you get 10 publications from a randomized controlled trial? You have different research questions, you have different subgroup analyses, you have methodological papers, you have reflection papers, and so forth. You have to be a bit creative. But the reason why I tell you this is not to give you ideas on how to, the different kinds of papers, but to tell you that you need to develop a publication plan in the very beginning. The publication plan includes the types of papers and I guess the different types of papers, right? Methodological reflection, subgroup analysis, different research questions, and includes the top 3 journals that you will submit each paper to, including its link, its impact factor, its cost, and other relevant details for the submission requirements. When looking for journals, look for different types of journals, right? Don't just look for, of course, you can prioritize your discipline-specific journals, right? So your ENT journals, of course, no doubt about that. Like discipline-specific journals, health system journals for health system papers, but there are also other types of journals, right? There's topic journals and methodology journals. So let's take an example. I'm looking at how people with chronic pain interact with the health system, right? What services they access, when they access, how they access. I may look at journals that are on generally health systems, right? BMC Health Services and Research is a health system journal. I may look at those that are specific to the disease, chronic pain journal, right? International Journal of Chronic Pain or something like that. Or even a pain journal, right? Not just a chronic pain journal, but a general pain journal. Or I may look at the methodology journals, right? So it's a qualitative study. I will look at the International Journal of Qualitative Methods because they generally do look at, that they do look for examples of studies to try to give advice on how to do qualitative methods. Those are the 3 types of journals you can look at, and consider all 3 of those within your publication plan. All these journals will be interested in your work, but will require slight different framing in order to be published, right? So, in the methodology journal, the main focus is the methodology teaching points, right? Not necessarily findings, but your findings are used to illustrate those methodological teaching points. And for the topic, like if it's a chronic pain journal, then you're focusing on the chronic pain aspect. If it's a pain journal, then you're also focusing on the chronic pain aspect, but you'll have to provide some implications for the broader pain research audience. And then for a health systems journal, you're looking at implications for the health system. So it's slightly framed differently. All of these would be interested in your work. So the peer review process, quickly on this, and if you're interested, I have a set of videos on the peer review process that I can send you. And they'll go a bit more detail on this, but I'll break it down for you very quickly. The peer review process technically starts upon when you submit an article. And that's the first stage, right? And really, when you submit an article, the editors of the journal that you submit to are sort of triaging your article, because they, especially in high-end journals, even any journal, really, journals receive lots of articles every day, and editors are triaging articles to decide whether they will send it out for a full review. And they usually use a set of characteristics, three of which include whether it fits within the journal scope, or if it fits with a special collection that they are focusing on at the moment of your submission. Does it have a clear and interesting abstract? They generally skim the entire paper. They won't read the entire paper, but they focus heavily on the abstract. And is it clear? Is it interesting? Is it catching their attention? And third, is it a hot topic? So during the COVID-19 pandemic, all the journals were opening the doors for any COVID-related publications because it's a hot topic. The triage process can take up to a month. If the editors do not want to continue with your article, they'll provide you with a desk rejection. So that's 1 month. However, if the editors want to continue with the article, they'll send it to peer reviewers who have previously published on the topic. So they're not necessarily experts. I've had peer reviews done and they've identified their names from students. So editors don't look for experts when it comes to peer review. Experts are usually too busy. They're not gonna, someone who's published extensively on your topic is not gonna peer review your article. It'll tend to be someone who's looking to do peer review. And sometimes may even be someone who has no idea what the topic is. The first peer review process can take up to from 3 months to a year. This is because of various things. It's extremely challenging for editors to secure peer reviewers for an article. If they're unable to secure peer reviewers, they will reject an article. And this has happened to me a few times. And it happens within the first 3 months after the submission. If they can't secure a peer reviewer, they can't review it, they reject the article. And I don't know why this happens. I haven't been part of a journal, but this does happen. So in the case you're on the rare receiving end of that, just keep this in mind. Peer reviewers are not compensated for the time, right? This is something that I have always wondered why. They're also not a major component of academic employment anymore, at least in Western countries. Yeah, you can do a peer review here and there, but it's not really like, no one really cares in the West anymore about peer reviews. But I know in a lot of countries, Pakistan and the Gulf, and having like hundreds of peer reviews is very reputable. I think that's a very cultural thing, and I don't know why, but the other point I wanted to make was that because peer reviewers are not compensated for their time, and I think they should be compensated for their time, but especially because I mean, this is getting to all like different topics, but journals are major corporations. Our entire careers are built on giving them articles that we spend years to create, doing the research for them to use for their profit, and also having them often to pay them to publish our work. Like it's an entire mess of a field that we're in. But this is the game, right? They're not compensated for the time, but they should be compensated because journals and journal publishers make tons and tons of money. They will review your article out of interest if they can't find a peer reviewer. But overall, this just means securing peer reviewers and having them review in a timely manner remains a huge challenge. After making so once the peer reviewers have reviewed your paper, the editors will review their comments and decide whether to accept, request major revisions, request minor revisions, or reject completely. In my experience, a decision to accept has never really been, maybe once or twice really after the first peer review. There's always some revisions. Like sometimes you must make minor revisions, especially if you get amazing peer reviewers and editors. Usually it's been major revisions, which is not a bad deal. I think having someone to accept with having a journal accept your paper with major revisions is probably the best conclusion because they're interested in your work and you can actually fix it up and potentially publish it. But after making these revisions, you'll have to go through probably another peer review process, maybe 1, maybe 2 times more. The most I've been through is 4 times, which is very rare, but it's usually 2 times. Once you've completed the peer review process, the proof editors will prepare your article's proof. So this is the journal version of your article. Most of the time, this is outsourced. Proof editors will fit your article into the journal's publishing template, and this can take about 2 months. You'll have an opportunity at this stage to make final changes to your manuscript. And once you have submitted the changes, the proof editors will take another month usually to finalize the paper. Once the paper has been finalized, it will appear online with a digital object identifier, DOI, which is a URL that stays permanent for your paper. But generally won't have an issue or volume until years later. It may take a journal of up to 2 years to provide indexing information to assign an issue and volume to your paper, but you can include it on your CV if it's published, but just won't have those details. That's the peer review process. I know Mubin has to go, so Mubin, spend a couple of minutes to just share some thoughts about what's been said. And then I'll do the writing exercise at the very end.
Yeah, so just like going off what Omer says, like I agree 100% with like everything that was like said. I think in terms of like the clinical aspect of writing, I think some things that maybe like we should also be aware of, especially like in our field of medicine, is kind of also kind of going with like what Omer says, like constantly reading and trying to figure out like what topics are relevant, especially in the field that you want to go into. For example, like I'm into like endocrinology, like I'm an endocrinology fellow, and one of the things that like is very common nowadays is like use of GLP-1 medicines and kind of like their side effects, their benefits and everything. So, like picking a topic or picking something or picking like a research that is related to that is probably more likely to get published nowadays, probably because it's such like a hot topic. It's very like it's something new in the field. So looking specifically like in the field that maybe you're interested in, trying to see like what the major journals are writing about and like what maybe like colleagues and like maybe people that you know in the field are like interested in, I think is good. Another thing is, like don't be discouraged if your research topic has been done before. Like a lot of these guidelines that they do like in medicine, like they're not just based off of just one research study. Oftentimes they do like meta-analyses. They try to combine the results of like a lot of different studies before they make any guideline changes. So just because a question has been asked before, doesn't mean that you can't do it again. Because always adding to the body of evidence that's already there, I think is always kind of helpful. I think because like kind of like what Omer is saying, like the same thing is that like just make sure that you have like a good research question and you know exactly like what you're kind of asking. Also, another thing with reading previous articles, like is that kind of what was alluded to before, is that you can find like gaps in maybe the research or a question that might not have been asked, and you'd be very surprised. I mean, there are very like big articles written in big journals that like although they're like published in big journals, like they still have maybe some major deficiencies that it's something that like can be further explored. For example, like there was one, I think there was a recently an article regarding how GLP-1 agonists may be able to help CKD, but like or prevention of CKD, but in that group, like they had patients that were also on an SGLT2 medicine, which is proven to help decrease, like CKD progression. So a big question to ask yourself is like, okay, like, like what would happen if we do like a direct trial to see which people do better, like the SGLT2 people or the people on GLP-1s. So always do your reading, like always make sure that you kind of like what's it called, always like be curious as to what might be the next step in asking a question. I think it's all like very useful. And don't think that, like just because something is published in a big journal like BMJ or NHGN that it doesn't have a deficiency. Like all articles definitely have like some sort of deficiencies in them. And what you should aim to do is maybe to look, like at areas that interest you and try to see like where can I contribute more to this field and where can I kind of like dig into those like deficiencies and like ask the question. And yeah, I think like I think like that's the main thing that I had to say is like try to look for things that are relevant in your field. because they're more likely to be published. Always read, as what Omer was saying. And I think like those are the main things. The more you read, you'll also find that different different parts of the world practice medicine differently. So, like I feel in the United States when I read articles from there, um, like their screening guidelines might be more aggressive than in Europe, and probably a part of that is because like how frequent, like litigation and people pursuing lawsuits is in the United States versus maybe in Europe. So it's also like kind of interesting to see how like just by reading you'll be able to better understand like kind of how medicine is practiced in different parts of the world. And also by reading more articles, you'll be able to better understand like which articles are written well. Like Omer was saying, like just because like an article is published in a journal doesn't mean that it's a good reliable source of information. You have to like read the deficiencies, read the participant pools, like read everything so that kind of to make yourself a better doctor. Like, does this even apply to the patients that I'm, like treating? So I think like those are the main things that I had to say. Yep.
Thanks, Mubin. Any questions for Mubin before he leaves?
All right. Sounds good. Thanks, Amir. Sorry, I had to go. I'm on call, so
Yeah, no worries.
going,
Thanks,
but
Mubin.
yeah. All right.
Yeah, enjoy. Shazim, you want to take a moment to share any thoughts you might have of what's been said? Anything else?
Yeah, thank you so much. Umair, how much time do I have to speak roughly based on the exercise and everything?
7 minutes.
Okay. Okay, so basically certain tips that I have that which I have found useful whilst writing and things that often guide me to write better. I've compiled like a list and I'd like to share them with you. Uh, what I think always centers me whilst writing and allows me not to sway away from the message that I want to convey is that what's that one central point? What's that one thing that I want to convey to my audience, right? There was one thing specific to this, or maybe a few things specific to this manuscript. Through this manuscript, I want to convey to my audience. And if I ever think, okay, maybe I'm going a bit too into the flow, if I always keep that central pivot in mind, I'll always get back to topic, right? And other than that, talking about the audience and what your objective is for the manuscript, I would always suggest that your writing style and the way you present your work depends on what you are doing, right? So maybe it's an academic journal for which you're publishing, maybe it's an abstract, maybe it's a poster. So depending on that, you'll have to change the way you're presenting. So for an academic journal, maybe you don't want to add too much fluff. For a clinical piece, you'll have to be highly formal, highly objective. But let's say an oral presentation or poster presentation, you want something that's more eye-catching. You'll use figures, you'll use certain things that will make you memorable in that conference, that will further give you more networking opportunities, and maybe even further work down the line. And this has helped me immensely. Maybe I've published something previously and it's going to be completely different from what I've written in an academic journal when I present it in a conference, right? Again, whenever you're going to write something, you have to know your audience. I'll write something completely different for, let's say, a highly specialized journal than for something that's a bit more general. And that really boils down to what the objective of my study is. Do I want to convey something which is like a general ENT thing that I want the mass medical community to know? Or is it something that only highly specialized individuals that are very deep into the field need to know? And based on that, I will use specific jargon I'll use specific ways of describing that will make it more clear to the audience that I have in mind. Is everything making sense up till now? Okay. Okay. So, another few tips is that remember you can't always write everything. One of the biggest dilemmas of academic publishing is that oftentimes, even whilst working with Umair, I've seen that we would often have a lot of findings because we would go very in depth. We wouldn't scrape the surface. But when we go to the journal's requirements, it's always going to be like 3,000, 4,000 words. And this is kind of a disservice when we have to condense such rich findings into such little or such a small, minute word limit. For that, I would suggest um, be as in-depth as you can, highlighting the main aspects of your study whilst respecting the word limit. And it's often very difficult. And I think the best way is that experience is the best teacher. Again, that central pivot, the few points that you need to convey them in the most detail that you can. And try to add as much nuance as possible. But at the end of the day, we'll still have to respect that word limit. One of the things I would like to highlight, it's just the last few points, is flow. And this is one thing that Umair has mentored me on immensely and has really changed the way I approach my work. If something does not flow properly, no one would want to read it, right? If there's something abruptly appears out of nowhere without any context, without significance, without any link to the previous content that you've written and the subsequent content that you write, it will just seem out of place and it will seem like a collection of random thoughts rather than a flowing piece that reads beautifully and leaves a long-lasting impact on the reader. And if it doesn't read well, you'll be confused, right? It just makes sense for a piece to flow beautifully. It will make a greater impact. And to do that, it's basically you have to link the previous things with the next thing. You have to establish a background to your subsequent statements that will make them clear and highlight the importance of why you're saying those specific things. And the last thing is just a few strategies that I personally use. Like if I ever have writer's block, I can't write anything. And that happens to everyone, I think. I don't think anyone is immune to that. And one of the best things I found is just to discuss, right? You have collaborators, even if you don't have many collaborators, well, mostly likely you do. If they're not available at that time due to time differences, due to differences in location, maybe just stating what you are doing, trying to explain to someone like your wife, your brother, anyone, just to get that out. It helps you organize your thoughts in a way that it makes you flow whilst writing. And this has helped me immensely if I ever have writer's block. And just writing anything, getting something on paper, I think it helps the initial inertia that, okay, this is something that I can't do right now, or is this something that is very difficult? It helps get over that initial hump. And maybe if you take a break and look at it again after 5 minutes, 10 minutes, an hour, 2 hours, as Umair said, when you look at it with a different perspective, it will help you immensely get over that initial hump. Yeah, that's it from me. I hope that was helpful. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Shazeen. That was very interesting and I think very helpful for everyone else. For the last 12 minutes, we'll go through a writing exercise that is just meant to help you practice some of the things we mentioned in this workshop. Some of the specific things, voice, conventions, concepts, assumptions, and other things. Because I know that when I was making this workshop at the very beginning, and I was thinking about what to say about the tricks of the trade, I knew it was going to be a very general explanation. So let's talk about the tricks of the trade and a few other things. So So let's read this together, and I'll start to highlight some of the things that are really important to include when you write papers. So let's start here. The recent study explored the relationship between socioeconomic status and health outcomes among urban populations. So the first thing to notice here is socioeconomic status. Why? This is part of an assumption that I was talking about. As you can notice that this is a public health article, probably just by the first sentence. And socioeconomic status is so interspersed with all public health topics that it's important to recognize that this is a key term that is being highlighted in the first sentence. Researchers conducted a cross-sectional survey. So let's stop there. Researchers conducted. I don't know if you noticed this, but researchers conducted a cross-sectional survey is active voice. Passive voice would have been a cross-sectional survey was conducted by researchers, right? But in this case, it's active voice, and it's pretty clear to me, and it's pretty compelling to me. It's not hard to read. But let's continue. Researchers conducted a cross-sectional survey collecting data from over 5,000 participants across various neighborhoods. The analysis revealed that lower socioeconomic status was significantly associated with higher incidences of chronic diseases such as diabetes and hypertension. Was significantly associated, right? The reason why I highlighted this is because, stepping back, when you read a paper, when there's a sentence that says significant or association, you're attending to that a bit more because we've been primed that papers, especially quantitative papers, are looking for significance, are looking for associations. And any sentence that has these words are, findings, are things that people are interested. They're interested in knowing what associations did you find? What statistically significant outcomes did you find? So that's very important to keep in mind, is that you have to use these words very, very carefully, in the sense that it should be associated with the with your findings and not others. So let me step back for a second. Let me step back further. In many papers, people use association and significant both in the context of statistics and both in the context of outside statistics. That you have to be very careful with, especially in your discipline that may be very statistics heavy. People might say, some general statement of that, researchers conducted or researchers significant, and the word significant is, the meaning of it can be bound to statistics more accurately, more precisely, but also can be used to emphasize importance on something. There's two ways to use it, but my recommendation for precise language and not to confuse another person about what you're saying in your findings is to only use significance and association and associated in the context where you actually statistically found them. So it's very important to have those precise languages. Why? Because in our disciplines, in statistics and quantitative, those are immediately associated with statistical language and not associated with the broader. So you don't want to confuse people. You want to have precise language in this case. And that's why I highlighted this right here. But let's continue. So additionally, the study found that individuals in lower socioeconomic brackets had reduced access to healthcare services, which exacerbated their health conditions. Had reduced access, right? This is emphasized here because it is a critical point related to the findings. They did the study, they described the study. The study found that individuals in lower socioeconomic brackets, the characteristic, the outcome had reduced access. And of course, the other implication related to this is that it exacerbated the health conditions. It's also very much related to a critical point related to the findings. And let's continue. I think there's two more here. These findings underscore the critical need. These findings underscore the critical need for targeted public health interventions to address the disparities in healthcare access and outcomes. Another aspect of the study involved examining the impact of education level on health literacy and preventive health behaviors. So education level in this case, it's another key variable study. This is also important. And then health literacy and preventative health barriers are other outcomes studies. So important to keep in mind of where you're placing different concepts, variables, and outcomes in your work. The data indicated that participants with higher education levels were more likely to engage in health promoting activities such as regular exercise and routine medical checkups. Conversely, those with lower education levels demonstrated low health literacy, often resulting in delayed treatment and poorer health outcomes. The study assumes that self-reported data on health behaviors and outcomes are accurate and reflective of participants' actual experiences. Assumes, right? So this is a very careful use of the word assume. When someone says assume, you're not associating that, you're not relating that to a statistical association, you're relating that to a conjecture, right? So this informs how the reader is going to read. So this is not an actual finding, but maybe an implication or some sort of teasing the relationship that they found, that the authors found. Study assumes that self-reported data on health behaviors and outcomes are accurate and reflective of participants' actual experiences. And then ending off, these results highlight the importance of educational initiatives aimed at improving health literacy to foster better health outcomes across all socioeconomic groups. That is the writing exercise to highlight voice, active versus passive, highlight some conventions, and highlight some assumptions that, often we don't really attend to explicitly, but they exist in all papers. And sometimes if we can really consider them, attend to them, and explicitly attend to them, we can deeply understand what we're saying and also deeply understand how we can say the ideas and arguments and findings that we have better in a way that makes more sense to experts, in a way that makes more sense to non-experts, in a way that makes sense to anyone who might randomly pick up your article and read it without having the necessary knowledge of the conventions, of the assumptions that exist in a discipline. That's the point I wanted to convey here, is that in writing, a lot of these are very implicit and no one really teaches you these things. You learn this over time through reading, rereading, writing, rewriting, reviewing others' work, having your work reviewed by others. But my purpose of this writing exercise and mentioning the tricks of the trade was to make it more explicit for you and set you apart from others who are going to continue writing without considering those assumptions and conventions and may not convey their ideas and arguments as effectively as you might. But that's all I have for this. This is the end of the workshop, but I will leave it open for a couple of minutes for you to ask any question that you might have in the chat or through the video. I'm going to stop recording. 1 second.